Thanks for joining us today on Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails. Last episode we talked about the general theme. Gosh, Jordan, remind me.
Oh, are they smarter than you?
Yes, and we decided that they're smarter than us, but in general they're not smarter than hunters. So, no, the takeaway was that they aren't smarter. But one of the side topics that came up had to do with nocturnal behavior. Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails is brought to you by Redneck Blinds, Day 6 Arrows, Code of Silence Apparel, Hunt Stand Pro Whitetail, Fuse Accessories, and Hoyt. People were saying that technically whitetails are not nocturnal. None of them are. And I mean, I would beg to differ that none of them are, because I've certainly seen in my hunting in Michigan, there was one spot that I hunted where I could see a little small patch of woods out in the middle of a field. And there was one old buck that bedded in there. I mean, old for Michigan, he was probably a 3-year-old. But he never came out of that patch until right at dark. And it was too small to sneak in there and try to put up a tree stand. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, that buck was nocturnal. At least
I guess it kind of depends on how you define nocturnal. Where, like, if you define it as, like, they sleep during the day and they're awake at night, that's one thing. Or if you define it as they are active at night, like they're up and moving around at night. Maybe they're awake, but they're just staying close to home during the day, but they're moving around at night. That would be nocturnal.
Yeah. I think the strict definition is in my mind, is they're in their bed until dark. Then they get up and move. That's nocturnal.
Okay.
So people are saying that that doesn't exist. And again, I do think there are special situations where even that behavior does exist. But the way I define nocturnal for hunting purposes has to do with whether or not they're vulnerable. So if they're not moving during the day, they might be on their feet. Maybe they're awake, which they don't sleep all day anyway.
Right.
So let's just say that they're on their feet, which would qualify as being quote-unquote active, maybe in a biological study, because they're not bedded. But they might not be moving very far at all from their bedding area.
So the takeaway is that while they might not be textbook definition nocturnal, they are not moving around / killable during the day.
Right, and I've always called those nocturnal bucks.
Right.
Because, to me, I never really differentiated between a deer that got up and stood, or walked in a circle 15 or 20 yards from his bedding area eating acorns versus one that, just stayed in his bed the whole time. I call that basically a nocturnal buck.
Right.
Because he's not moving or traveling.
And the problem with that then is it'd be really hard to kill the ones that are, even if they are awake, but they're in their bedding area, because those are those areas that we've talked about before, but you wouldn't want to go in there and risk stirring it up and disturbing them, so it would be kind of a lot more challenging.
It's just hard. It's hard to hunt them where they bed.
Right.
During the rut, you can kind of get away with it because there's so much movement that the deer are coming and going all the time. But during other parts of the season, if you try to hunt a deer where he beds, a buck where he beds, it's super hard to beat him in there in the morning because they bed so early. They're back to their bed so early. Mm-hmm. And then they might be on their feet an hour before the end of legal shooting time, let's say, but they're still right there.
Right.
So for you to get close enough to that spot to realistically be hunting him, you'd have to be taking a lot of risk pressing in.
Sleeping in the woods.
Yeah. Or, even if you're trying to sneak in at midday from the afternoon hunt. So people think, well, why don't you just sneak within 100 yards? Well, that's all fine and good if he beds in the same exact spot every time.
Right.
But he doesn't, though. So even that strategy is pretty questionable, because while you're sneaking up to the spot where you think he usually beds, or maybe he does usually bed there, but not always, you could bump him somewhere else.
Right.
So anytime that they're not traveling during daylight hours, I consider them to be very hard to hunt. Mm-hmm. As far as I'm concerned, in my mindset, that was nocturnal. But I understand the biologists have done a number of radio collared surveys, and they've determined that bucks do get on their feet during the day. Mm-hmm. that they don't spend the whole day bedded.
But these specific ones that we were talking about in last week's episode, we said they're nocturnal. They might be on their feet, but they're not traveling.
Right. They're
Right.
not really that killable.
Right.
So anyway, it's kind of a matter of how you define it. But, I have talked to a lot of the biologists about this, and I understand what they're saying. It doesn't really help me as a deer hunter, though. Because if I put my trail cameras in locations that make sense, like trying to figure out, okay, what deer are active, etc., there's a period of time where I just don't get any pictures of bucks hardly. About the first 3 weeks of October. And I've always called it the October lull. And then you get people coming along now saying, well, there is no October lull. Well, come and look at my trail cameras. So what they're saying is, oh, your trail cameras are in the wrong place. Well, I get that. But to put my trail camera in the right place, it's too risky. So that's the lull to me. The lull isn't maybe necessarily a behavioral thing as it is a hunting strategy thing.
Right,
There's a period there where they're really hard to kill.
right,
Maybe they're moving somewhere. It's just not in places that make them vulnerable.
right.
I guess we go back and recap what we talked about last week too. They aren't smarter than us as much as they are nocturnal. Well, okay, there we go again. As much as they are acting in a way that makes them invulnerable. In my mind, I call it nocturnal.
During the day.
Yeah. Nocturnal, they aren't easily huntable or killable during the day.
Okay.
That's the nocturnal
Yes.
definition for
Got
our
it.
purposes. So anyway, that's this whole discussion of nocturnal. I think it's important because you have to be able to play that risk versus reward puzzle, or I call it a chess match. You're always balancing the amount of risk you take of educating a buck with the potential reward of having that deer come by within bow range.
Right,
So when they are more daylight active, moving more during the day, that risk versus reward starts flipping your way more towards reward, because the risk that you take of being there is more likely to be rewarded because the deer are already showing a tendency of moving during the day. So if a buck is acting like he's not killable, it's too much risk.
to try to figure out how to kill him.
Right, because if your chances then of educating him and making him much harder to kill later
Right,
is too high.
so it's better to just write it off as he's currently nocturnal.
Right,
And then wait.
yeah, and keep monitoring that deer, waiting for those opportunities when it makes sense. So we talked about the green lights, and that's the whole game, I think. The whole strategy of killing whitetails consistently, I think, comes down to playing that game, that risk versus reward game. We've got some merchandise that we've come up with. Actually, Jordan designed this stuff, so she's got one of the hats on. Here's another one. I think they're really cool hats. I think she did a really nice job. We won't do this to you very often. We just wanted to show off the work that Jordan did, and you can stop by shop bowhuntingwhitetails.com, and you'll find this stuff. And once in a while, we'll add to it.
Yeah, I am working on some more designs already, so.
This is stuff that she loves. So, in the long term, we're hoping to make the merchandise a bigger and bigger part of our business so that Jordan can really dive into that. But anyway, we appreciate you following along. And I think this discussion needed clarification, because I think there's a lot of confusion when people start saying bucks aren't nocturnal. Then everybody thinks, oh, I can kill them. Well, yeah, they aren't nocturnal, but you still have a hard time killing them
Right.
sometimes.
The
So,
summary that I took from this is that it really depends on your definition of it, but for this discussion and for when you're discussing whitetails and bow hunting, nocturnal means not daylight active, not vulnerable. Like they're in their bedding areas, they'd be really.
they just aren't traveling.
And then the risk would be way heavier weighted than the reward of trying to kill them
Yeah,
in those times.
that's right. Well, thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you right back here again next week for the next episode of Hoyt's Bowhunting Whitetails. And remember to always...
Dream big.
Yep.
I never know when you're gonna make me say it or when you're
Just
gonna
about
say
every
it.
time.
Yeah, but I never know if it's gonna be remember to always dream big, or if you're gonna say remember to always. I'm gonna say dream big.
Okay. I'll remember that.
Okay.